Hi, I am here to tell you the story of Bumpy Johnson, the Harlem kingpin who faced the entire Italian Mafia with nothing but his reputation. It's a story of how calm intelligence can be more powerful than brute force. Subscribe and hit the bell for more untold stories of criminal legends. Chapter 1. The Midnight Standstill. The clock tower struck midnight. The sound echoed over empty streets, a heavy, final toll. Down below, on the rain-slicked asphalt of 125th Street, steam rose from the manholes like ghosts escaping the underworld. Storefronts were dark, their steel gates pulled down tight. But Harlem was not asleep. Behind drawn curtains and in darkened alleyways, eyes were watching. They always were. A black Cadillac, polished to a mirror sheen, glided to a stop. The engine cut, plunging the block into a deeper silence. Bumpy Johnson stepped out. He wore a tailored suit, dark as the night itself, the crease in his trousers sharp enough to cut glass. He adjusted his cufflinks, a small, deliberate motion. His face was a mask of composure, revealing nothing. He stood by the hood of his car alone. He was not carrying a weapon. This was a calculated decision, an opening statement in a negotiation that had not yet begun. A man who brings a gun to a meeting expects a fight. A man who brings only himself expects respect. Headlights cut through the darkness from the other end of the street. One pair, then two, then three. A procession of heavy American sedans, chrome gleaming under the streetlights. They parked in a semicircle, their engines rumbling, a low growl that vibrated through the pavement. Car doors opened. Men emerged, clad in long coats, their hats pulled low. 10 of them, maybe 12. Shadows stretched long and thin, their hands buried in their pockets. You didn't need to see the steel to know it was there. They were a delegation of force, an invading army, in miniature, sent from downtown to test the borders of a kingdom. They stopped 30 feet from Bumpy's Cadillac, a line of grim-faced soldiers. The man in the center, older, with a camel hair coat draped over his shoulders, stepped forward. His name didn't matter. His title didn't matter. He was a message, sent by the commission. He looked at Bumpy, then glanced at the empty street, the silent buildings. His expression was one of confusion, of insult. This wasn't the reception he'd expected. He'd come prepared for a war council, for a show of strength. He found only a king on an empty throne. A long moment passed. The only sound was the hum of their engines and the distant wail of a lone siren. The man in the coat finally spoke, his voice gravelly, impatient. "You're alone." Bumpy's gaze didn't waver. He looked past the man, past his soldiers, to the rows of brownstones and apartment blocks that faded into the night. He saw the homes he protected, the families he kept safe, the businesses that paid him tribute not out of fear, but out of loyalty. He let the silence hang in the air, a weapon in itself. Then his voice, calm and even, cut through the tension. "This is Harlem," Bumpy said. "I'm never alone." The words settled over the street, a quiet declaration of power that no army could match. The men in coats shifted on their feet. The man in the center stared, his certainty beginning to fray. He had brought guns. Bumpy had brought the entire neighborhood. Chapter 2. The King of Harlem. To understand the man, you must first understand his kingdom. Bumpy Johnson's Harlem was more than a collection of streets on a map. It was an ecosystem, and he was its heart. His day did not begin in a boardroom. It began on the sidewalk. A slow walk down Lenox Avenue was a tour of his domain. He'd stop at a bakery, not for the bread, but for the conversation. The owner would speak of a supplier issue, and a quiet word from Bumpy later that day would resolve it. No threats, just a call from a man whose name carried weight. He moved through the neighborhood with an unhurried grace. People didn't part for him out of fear. They made way for him out of respect. A nod from Bumpy was a blessing. A handshake was a contract. He owned restaurants he never ate in and nightclubs where he never danced. They were investments in the community, places that kept people employed and money circulating within Harlem's borders. His protection was not a shakedown. It was insurance. Insurance against outside forces, against chaos, against the kind of violence that disrupted life and business. The numbers game, the foundation of his wealth, was woven into the fabric of daily life. Old women on their stoops, playing the daily digit, factory workers pooling their nickels and dimes. It was a community lottery, and Bumpy, was its trusted banker. The runners were his messengers, his eyes and ears on every block. They collected slips, but they also collected information. They knew who was struggling, whose child was sick, who needed a helping hand. A portion of the profits flowed back, unseen. A widow's rent paid for a year. A promising student's tuition covered. A family's funeral costs settled. This wasn't charity. It was governance. It was the price of loyalty, and Bumpy paid it without fanfare. His authority was quiet, almost invisible. He held court not on a throne, but at a corner table in a dimly lit jazz club. A whispered word, a subtle gesture, a long, thoughtful draw from a cigarette. That was all it took. Disputes were settled. Deals were brokered. Sentences were passed. He rarely raised his voice. He understood that true power doesn't need a shout. Shouting is a sign of weakness, a loss of control. Bumpy's control was absolute because it was internal. He was a master of restraint in a world defined by excess. While other men chased flashy cars and loud suits, Bumpy pursued stability. He was a scholar of power, a student of history. He read voraciously, philosophy, poetry, biographies of kings and conquerors. He understood that empires weren't held by brute force alone. They were held by the consent of the governed. And the people of Harlem had given him their consent. They saw him not as a criminal, but as a provider, a protector, their protector. In a city that had drawn a line and placed them on the other side, Bumpy Johnson had built a fortress. And when the Italian Mafia came knocking at midnight, they weren't just challenging him. They were challenging every single person living inside those walls. Chapter 3. The Commission's Demand. The meeting was not on Bumpy's turf, nor was it on theirs. Neutral ground. A private room in a downtown hotel, so opulent it felt sterile. The air was thick with the smell of cigar smoke and expensive cologne. Bumpy sat at one end of a long mahogany table. He had brought 2 men. They stood by the door, silent and watchful. They were formality. The real power in the room was seated. At the other end of the table sat representatives from the 5 families. Vincent the Chin Gigante, Thomas Lucchese, men whose names were spoken in whispers. They were the board of directors for organized crime in New York City, and they wanted to discuss a merger. Gigante did the talking. He spoke in a low, almost bored tone, as if the matter was already decided. Harlem is changing, he began, steepling his fingers. The game is bigger now. The product is different. He meant heroin. The commission saw a gold mine in Harlem, a captive market they believed was being mismanaged. They saw Bumpy's numbers rackets and small-time operations as antiquated, leaving money on the table. We admire what you've built, Gigante continued, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. You've kept the peace. You have discipline. We respect that. The word respect was a weapon in this room. It was offered like a truce, but it could be withdrawn like a blade. But the future requires a new structure, a partnership. The terms were laid out. The families would control the supply of narcotics in Harlem. Bumpy would manage the distribution on the street. He would be their man on the ground, his network, their product. In return, he would receive a percentage. A generous one, Gigante stressed. He would be wealthier than ever. Bumpy listened. He did not interrupt. He sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable. He let the silence after the offer stretch out, making them wait. He knew this wasn't an offer. It was an ultimatum. The subtext was clear. Accept this new hierarchy, or be removed from the equation entirely. They saw him as a manager, not a king. He took a slow sip of water. The small sound seemed to echo in the tense room. My business, Bumpy said finally, his voice soft but firm, is my own. My people are my own. He wasn't refusing. Not yet. He was restating a fact. He was reminding them who he was and what he controlled. He was telling them that Harlem was not a piece of property to be traded. Your product brings a different kind of trouble, he continued. It brings addiction. It brings desperation. It brings the kind of heat that is bad for everyone's business. The numbers game is quiet. It builds community. What you're selling tears it apart. Lucchese, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. His voice was sharper, colder. The world is what it is, Bumpy. You can't stop the tide from coming in. You can either build a boat or you can drown. Bumpy looked from one man to the other. He saw their conviction. They believed they were inevitable. They believed he had no choice. I appreciate the offer, Bumpy said, rising slowly from his chair. "And I will give it the consideration it deserves." He hadn't said no, but he hadn't said yes. He had done something far more dangerous. He had asserted his right to choose. He walked out of the room, leaving the commission with an answer they did not expect. A man who valued his kingdom more than their money. The war was not yet declared, but the first shot had been fired. It was a shot of defiance. Chapter 4. A Public Affront. The commission did not wait long for an answer. They decided to force one. The affront came on a Tuesday afternoon, in the heart of Bumpy's territory. It was brutally simple and deeply insulting. One of Bumpy's primary number spots, a corner candy store run by an old man named Pop, who had been a fixture in the neighborhood for 40 years, was hit. It wasn't a robbery. A robbery is about money. This was about a message. Two of the commission's thugs, low-level enforcers sent to prove a point, walked in just after the 3 o'clock school rush. The place was empty except for Pop. They didn't wear masks. They wanted to be seen. They didn't touch the money in the register. Instead, they overturned the counter, sending jars of candy crashing to the floor. They tore up the day's betting slips, scattering them like confetti. They made a mess, a public and deliberate desecration of a space under Bumpy's protection. Then, they laid hands on Pop. They didn't beat him badly. Just a shove, a push that sent the old man stumbling back into a rack of newspapers. It was enough. It was a violation. They had touched one of his own. The entire act took less than a minute. They walked out, got into a car, and drove away. The neighborhood fell silent. Word spread faster than fire. By the time Bumpy arrived, a crowd had gathered across the street. They were quiet, their faces a mixture of fear and expectation. This was a test. The Italians had openly challenged their king, not in a back alley, but in the light of day. Bumpy stepped through the door. The bell tinkled mockingly. He saw the shattered glass, the scattered papers, the old man sitting on a stool, his hands trembling. Pop wasn't looking at the mess. He was looking at Bumpy. His eyes held a question. What are you going to do? It was the same question on everyone's mind. The street expected blood. The code was simple. An eye for an eye. A public insult demanded a public and violent response. Bumpy was expected to send his men to find the two thugs and leave them in a gutter. It was the old way. It was the gangster's way. Bumpy walked over to Pop and helped him to his feet. Are you hurt? Bumpy asked, his voice low. Pop shook his head. Just my pride, Bumpy. They did this to disrespect you. Bumpy looked around at the wreckage. He saw past the broken glass. He saw the strategy. This wasn't an attack. It was a trap. A violent reprisal would escalate the situation into a full-blown war. A war the commission was prepared for. A war that would bleed Harlem dry. They wanted him to react with mindless fury. They were goading him, trying to turn him into the kind of thug they understood. He stood in the center of the ruined shop for a long time. The crowd outside watched, waiting. His own men, standing by the door, were tense, ready for the order to kill. Bumpy gave a different order. Clean this up, he said quietly to one of his lieutenants. Pay for all the damages. Double it. Tell Pop to close for the week and take a rest. He turned and walked out of the shop. He didn't address the crowd. He simply got into his car and was driven away. The silence he left behind was heavier than before. It was a silence of confusion, of disappointment. To many, it looked like weakness. It looked like he had backed down. But Bumpy wasn't playing their game. He was playing his own. He knew that the most powerful response was not to meet violence with more violence. It was to deny them the war they craved. It was a display of supreme control, of a man so confident in his power that he refused to be provoked. He had been publicly disrespected, and he had chosen to answer with calm, deliberate inaction. The insult was a move on a chessboard, and Bumpy Johnson was already thinking 3 moves ahead. Chapter 5. The Price of Peace. The lack of retaliation was a deafening silence. The commission didn't understand it. In their world, inaction was weakness. They mistook Bumpy's restraint for fear. They grew bold. They assumed he was broken. That was his plan all along. The call for a final sit-down came a week later. They chose a location, a warehouse in the Bronx, their territory. A place of steel and shadow, designed to intimidate. They were expecting a surrender. Bumpy arrived, as before, with only 2 men. He walked into the cavernous space. 20 of the commission's soldiers lined the walls, a silent, menacing gallery. At the center of the floor, under a single bare bulb, stood Gigante and Lucchese. Gigante gestured to the empty space around them. "We expected you to bring an army, Bumpy. We heard there was some trouble in your neighborhood." The condescension was thick. Bumpy stopped 10 feet from them. He surveyed the room, his gaze moving slowly from one armed man to the next. He wasn't intimidated. He was assessing. "There was a misunderstanding," Bumpy said, his voice even. "Some of your men got lost. They made a mess. I had it cleaned up." He wasn't acknowledging the insult. He was dismissing it. He was reframing their act of aggression as a petty mistake, the work of undisciplined children who had wandered off and caused trouble. He was stripping them of their power by refusing to recognize it. Lucchese's face tightened. "Don't play games. We're here to give you one last chance. You work for us, or you are erased." Bumpy smiled. A slow, knowing smile that was more unnerving than any threat. "The problem with your offer," he said, "is that you think you're the only ones with leverage. You want to sell your product in my home, but you can't do it without me. If you kill me, another man will take my place, and he will fight you, and another after him. You will be fighting for every block. Every day, there will be bodies on both sides. There will be police. There will be federal agents. Your quiet business will become a very loud war." He paused, letting his words sink in. "This war you want, it is bad for my business, but it is a catastrophe for yours. How much money are you making in the other 4 boroughs? How much of that are you willing to lose to win a piece of Harlem?" He had turned the tables completely. He was no longer the one being threatened. He was the one explaining the consequences of their actions. He was teaching them the economics of the situation. "You have 2 options," Bumpy continued, his voice dropping, becoming a quiet force of reason in the vast, hostile room. "You can have a war with me, which you might win, eventually, but it will cost you millions. It will attract attention you don't want. Or, you can have a partnership." Gigante scoffed. "That's what we offered you." "No," Bumpy corrected him. "You offer me a job. I'm offering you a partnership. A true one." The terms were laid out, this time by him. The commission could bring their product to Harlem, but they would sell it to Bumpy. He, and he alone, would control all distribution within Harlem's borders. He would set the price on the street. He would manage the network. He would pay them a flat, wholesale rate. He was no longer their employee. He was their biggest customer. They would be his suppliers. Furthermore, a tax, a percentage of their profits, paid to him, for the privilege of doing business in his territory, for keeping the peace. It was audacious. It was brilliant. He had used their own aggression to justify his demands. He was making them pay for the war they had threatened to start. Gigante and Lucchese stared at him, stunned into silence. Their soldiers lining the walls were motionless. They had come to witness a man break. Instead, they were watching a masterclass in negotiation. "You don't get to disrespect my home and walk away without paying a price," Bumpy said, his voice now cold steel. "The mess your boys made in Pop's store. This is the price. This is the deal. Or we can have that war you wanted so badly. It makes no difference to me. I was born in the fire. You just work near it." He held their gaze. The choice was theirs. A river of blood, or a river of gold that flowed on his terms. Chapter 6, A Quiet Legacy. The deal was made. There was no handshake, just a quiet, grudging acceptance from men who had been outmaneuvered. Bumpy Johnson walked out of that warehouse not as a vassal, but as a sovereign. The war never came. The streets of Harlem remained quiet. The flow of narcotics began, as he knew it would, but it flowed through his channels, governed by his rules. The violence was contained. The chaos was managed. The tax he levied from the commission was not pocketed. It became a fund. The Harlem Defense Fund, he called it. It was money used to hire lawyers for people unjustly arrested. It paid for bail. It supported civil rights activists. It was the blood money of the drug trade, laundered through an act of community protection. Bumpy was taking poison and turning it into medicine. His legend changed. Before, he was known for his iron fist, his willingness to meet violence with violence. After, he became known for his mind. He had faced down the most powerful criminal organization in the country and had not fired a single shot. He had won a war by refusing to fight. His power was no longer just about controlling the streets. It was about influencing the future. He hosted politicians in the same backrooms where he met with hustlers. He donated to churches and to radical thinkers. He understood that the board was bigger than he had ever imagined. The fight for Harlem wasn't just against the mob. It was against poverty, injustice, and a system designed to keep his people down. He continued his walks down Lenox Avenue. The nods of respect he received were deeper now. The people had seen the test. They had seen the public affront at Pop's store and had felt a tremor of fear. And then they had seen the outcome: peace. They didn't know the details of the deal made in a Bronx warehouse. They only knew that Bumpy had stood between them and the fire, and he had not flinched. He remained a man of contradictions, a gangster who quoted philosophers, a racketeer who funded scholarships, a purveyor of vice who commanded unwavering moral authority in his community. In the end, Bumpy Johnson's greatest victory was not over the Mafia. It was over the cycle of violence. He demonstrated a different kind of power, the power of restraint, of intellect, of seeing the entire chessboard while his enemies saw only the next move. He built a legacy not on the bodies he buried, but on the lives he protected. He was the king of Harlem, not because he was the most ruthless, but because he understood that true control came not from breaking your enemies, but from making them believe your peace was more profitable than their war.